Hey guys, in this video I have 7 patch tips to share with you for the Moog Grandmother. All of them involve jacks and patch cables in some way, so let's get right into it. Alright, tip number 1. Did you know that the Moog Grandmother actually has 4 different oscillators, or at least 4 ways to generate tones? The first 2 are the main oscillators, which you're familiar with, and then you have the filter. So a common trick is for when you have self-oscillating filters, you crank the resonance all the way up, and then the filter starts producing a sine wave at the frequency of the cutoff frequency. Then you can set keyboard tracking to 1-to-1, and this means that the keyboard here will play musical notes on the cutoff frequency of the filter here. So if I turn off all the oscillators, we're not getting any sounds from here. If I could play the filter now. And the 4th oscillator is actually the LFO here, which surprisingly enough can get into audio rate, and its rate input tracks volt per octave, so it can track the keyboard just like the filter can. Alright, the first thing we need to do is patch out the keyboard CV here, which is the voltage created by the keyboard, and we patch that into the rate input of our LFO here. Then you want to set the rate to maximum so that it starts oscillating at audio signals that you can hear. Then set the waveform to any of the things you want in order to get the sound you want. Let's just set it to sine wave for now. And then finally, in order to get the sound out of this, we need to patch it into our mixer. So I can grab the wave output and feed it into the noise input of the mixer. So effectively, we're replacing the noise with this LFO/oscillator now. And now I can play it on my keyboard. And of course, now we can blend it in with the other oscillators as well. So you can bring up the others. So you just tune it by ear. So you get it to a rough ballpark. So one trick you can do is hold the shift button, and then the rate knob turns into very fine grain control. So effectively we have a 3 oscillator synth, and of course I can change this to a sawtooth as well. Alright, tip number 2 has to do with the high pass filter here and ways that we can process signals independently from other signals. So the first step is, how do we run the noise through the high pass filter without running the oscillators through the high pass filter? So let's bring up the noise. So if we wanted to run the noise alone through the high pass filter, we'd go from the mixer output through our high pass filter and then continue on to the low pass filter. So now I can high pass filter the noise. But what about the oscillators? Right now I have them turned down, but if I bring them up, effectively everything gets passed through the high pass filter. So if I want to avoid that, I have to use the utility mult here to sum up the signals independently of the mixer. So I'm going to keep my oscillators down, and instead I'm going to patch the oscillators through the utility mult here. So I can patch wave 1 into one of the inputs, my high pass filter into one of the outputs, then filter 2 again through one of the inputs. And now that we have those all combined, we can run that through the low pass filter now. So effectively what I'm doing is, instead of using the mixer to mix the 3 signals, I'm using this utility mult. And of course you lose the ability to change the volume between them. But at least now the noise is running through the high pass filter, but the oscillators aren't. So now I can shape by noise independently of the other 2 oscillators. And we can do a very similar thing. For example, if you wanted to run oscillator 2 through high pass and oscillator 2 through low pass completely independently. So the way to do that is we have to kind of recreate the signal ourselves. So I'm going to grab the raw output of oscillator 2 and run that through the high pass filter. Then the output of the high pass filter I'm going to run into the mult here, because we're going to combine the signals. And then we're going to run oscillator 2 through the low pass filter, which is what we want. And then the output of the low pass filter I'm going to mix into my utilities. I can run this into my VCA to get the final output. So now we have completely independent parallel filters, 1 and 2, one for each oscillator. So now you can hear oscillator 1 is low pass filtered only, and oscillator 2 is high pass. Alright, tip number 3 is very similar, except this time we're going to run the filters in series, which means that it's going to go through the high pass first, then low pass, or the other way around, first low pass, then high pass, which gives you a lot more freedom and effectively gives you a bandpass filter. So let's see first how to do high pass through low pass. So this one is the simplest. Effectively, you just grab the output of your mixer and run it through the high pass filter, and then you run the high pass filter output into the input of the filter. And simple enough, we've just inserted a high pass filter in between the mixer and the filter. And this is really good for creating those kind of vocal sounds, because normally you want that bandpass filter where the 2 frequencies are changing. Next up, very similar, if you want to do the other way around, go low pass first, then high pass. Again, we just grab the output of our low pass filter, run it through the high pass filter. And then we continue our chain and go from the output of the high pass filter into our VCA input. Now everything gets mixed into the low pass filter first, and then we get a high pass to kind of roll off the bottom end if we wanted to. All right, tip number 4, I'm going to show you how to do a vibrato and a tremolo effect using just the synthesizer, no external effects. So just to recap, a vibrato is a change in pitch over time, a very small change, and a tremolo is a change in volume over time. So let's start with vibrato. All right, vibrato is super simple. We actually don't need any patch cables. You just use your LFO here, increase the pitch modulation amount, turn up your mod wheel just a bit, and then you're going to hear the oscillator change in pitch over time. You could, of course, create the same effect using patch points only without changing these knobs or the mod wheel at all. So I can grab the raw output of the modulator, feed it through this attenuator here, and then grab that output and feed it to the pitch of my oscillator, and we'll get the same effect. And then the attenuator effectively controls the amount. All right, next we have tremolo, which is again is a change in volume. So the way to change volume is to use the voltage controlled amplifier here. So what I'm going to do is patch out the waveform of the LFO here through the attenuator because we want to have a little more control. And then I'm going to patch that into the VCA amount input here, which will control effectively the volume using the LFO giving us tremolo. And one thing you want to do is make sure you set this to drone so that we have full control over the control voltage here. So now this knob here controls the amount of tremolo we're getting. And of course we can change the rate here. And if we go into audio rate, we're effectively getting AM or amplitude modulation. And of course we can apply an envelope to our filter here independently. And we're getting these interesting. And one cool thing you can do here is use the envelope to control the rate. All right, in tip number 5, I'm going to show you how to generate random notes every time you press a different key. And we're going to use the sample and hold circuit for that in combination with the sync input, which every time it receives a gate, it'll sample a new voltage. So first thing you want to do is turn the rate all the way down here. Then we're going to grab the gate output from our keyboard and feed it into the sync input so that every time we fire a gate, we're going to get a new sampled voltage. Next, we're just going to grab the sample and hold output and feed it into the pitch input of our oscillator. So now every time I press a key, I'm getting different voltages. We could, of course, attenuate the signal so that we're not getting the full range of pitches like that. So I'm going to grab the sample and hold output, feed it through the attenuator, and then feed it into the pitch of my oscillator. So now we can control the range of pitch that is being randomized. So it could just be a little or extreme. And of course, you don't have to use it to control pitch, which is a more drastic effect. You can use it to control, for example, the pulse width modulation here. So I'm going to set this to a different wave. So now every time I press the key, we're getting a random duty cycle. And of course, we can feed it into other things like cutoff frequency of the low pass filter here. All right, so tip number 6 is a bit of a weird one. It's how to add kind of really angry, demonic, demented, possessed sounds to your synthesizer here. So we're going to use the modulation section and effectively just take it to its extremes. All right, so the first thing we're going to do without even patching anything in is just put the pitch amount and cutoff frequency amount to its extreme values here. And then we're going to bring that up to see what that sounds like. And then we're going to increase the rate of this into audio rate. So you see you're already getting these really insane sounds. Believe it or not, we can get even crazier with this by using the attenuator. So one cool thing about the attenuator is if you don't have anything patched in, it defaults to a DC value. So effectively it gives you a steady voltage to choose from. So what this allows us to do is add even more range to our rate here. So if I feed the attenuator output into the rate input here, we can just take this to the max. You can change the waveform. The square wave really gives you these crazy angry sounds. Now it just sounds like a dying cat. And then you can just blend in the craziness. And finally, the last tip, tip number 7, which is my personal favorite, is how to add kind of an eerie undertone by patching in the reverb and mixing it into your signal. So let me show you what I mean. So what's cool about the reverb on the Grandmother is that you can actually extract it and use it as a standalone independent reverb effect for other gear. So there's a reverb input jack here which feeds into that. And then in the back of the synth, there's a reverb output which gives you the fully wet reverb output. And that's what I have patched into this cable here. So what I'm going to do here is blend the fully wet reverb processing oscillator 2 with the raw tone of oscillator 1 unaffected by the reverb, if that makes sense. So let me just demonstrate what I mean. I have the reverb output here. I'm going to patch it into the noise input of the mixer, effectively replacing noise with the raw, wet reverb tone. And since I don't want all the signal to go through the reverb, I'm going to patch the oscillator 2 waveform directly into the reverb input. So this way, oscillator 2 is the only sound source that'll get processed by the reverb. So now if I bring up that amount, you're going to hear the wet reverb processing oscillator 2 here. And since oscillator 2 is being tracked by pitch, we can get a sort of eerie melodic. And what's cool now is I can blend that with the normal path of oscillator 1. So since we have our standard mixer here, I can just bring up oscillator 1. Of course, I can use a low pass filter, which again doesn't affect the reverb. The other thing you can do if the sound is too muffled and muddy, you can first run that raw reverb wet signal through the high pass filter. So I'm just going to patch that through here and then patch it back into my noise input here. So if I turn off oscillator 1 just so you can hear it, this is the raw signal. So now we can high pass filter the signal of the raw reverb and remove some of that low end that will muddy up the sound. And again, I can blend in oscillator 1, which gives you this really interesting eerie sound. And of course, I can patch it into the oscillator 2 input instead here so that we can free up the noise. Alright, so that wraps up the 7 tips I had for you for the Grandmother. Hopefully you learned something. And if you guys have any cool tips that you like, please leave them in the comment because I want to learn as much as possible. The synth is blowing my mind every day. I discover something new. So definitely going to be making more content for this. So stay tuned, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you guys in the next one.